Welcome, everyone, to SphinxConnect's 2022 Forging Alliances and our panel, all about the Benjamins. My name is Taneshia Nash Laird from Newark Symphony Hall in Newark, New Jersey, and I am your active moderator for this session. We have some dynamic panelists, Ana de Archuleta, Leanne Norman, Omari Rush, and Marc Scorca, and they're going to introduce themselves and give some opening remarks. But first, some housekeeping. We want to include you in everything that we're doing here, and there's an opportunity for you to put your questions and comments. So as we're talking, something strikes you, please navigate over to the Q&A button under the Ballroom tab located on the right side of your screen. Again, this session is all about the Benjamins, and you're here because you were intrigued by the description. Our field exhibits recurring allergic reactions to numbers when it comes to setting goals, quotas for reprioritizing serious issues like representation. But if budgets are moral documents, how can we ensure change without marked commitments to resources dedicated to help us walk the walk? So at this point, I want to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give an open remark about this particular topic. I'm going to start with Ana.
Hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be part of this amazing SphinxConnect. It's my first time. It is with great humility and constant curiosity that I communicate on this subject. I've been, for the last 2 decades, representing artists in the opera industry. And as of 6 months ago, I started working as a director of artistic operations for National Sawdust. And National Sawdust is an institution that whose mission is to cultivate an ecosystem of learning, incubation, and dissemination, rooted in open and inclusive music and artistic curiosity. This ecosystem of learning, incubation, and dissemination, what does this mean? It means we live and breathe the future of the art in our world. It means we have to invest in people. We constantly think about our financials. We are very aware of the challenges the nonprofit arts organizations face on a day-to-day basis. We know that the art and the people we should lead, yet the system has us in constant search of collaborators, partners, and funders. We have our audience challenges and our financial challenges to make the art work. But on top of that, we have to invest and focus on people. It is important that as we plan our seasons, and it's important as we start collaborations and partnerships, that we start listening to the other side of the table, and that we include that in our planning, our financial planning for institutions. At National Sawdust, we have a great history of including this in our in everything we do, from financial to planning to programming to production. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think we are, like you said, we are sort of afraid of how much it's going to cost us to make those changes. 2020 changed us, all of us, and it made us look at that balance sheet and that P&L and say, how can I find money? How can I find within this structure money to make the changes that we need to make to grow as an industry? So I'm honored to be here and to share the panel with this amazing panelist. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana. Leanne, your comments on this topic, and introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Taneshia, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leanne Norman, and I am a Director of Learning and Leadership Programs at the League of American Orchestras, which is the national member association for symphonies in North America, essentially. And one of my primary roles is working with our regranting programs, one of which is the Catalyst Fund, which really helps orchestras think about how to be more equitable, diverse, and inclusive, and how to improve their practice and understanding. I think as an organization, the League has taken some really important steps in the last few years to not only create a model for the field to think about, how do you match your values and your actions when it comes to being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, but we've also sort of reflected that back to ourselves. We're also thinking about what difficult conversations do we have to have around the infrastructure, the the people and the time that is required to support those financial resources that we've invested in and make them sustainable. And we're asking our members to do the same kinds of things. We realize that maybe there are some difficult conversations that need to happen. Not everything is for everyone, so maybe we can't partner with someone in certain ways anymore because we are leading with our values. Maybe our members are having those kinds of difficult conversations as well. But I really do think that it's about integrity when you're thinking about financial resources and how you invest them. You can't be divided as an individual or an institution if your values aren't matching your actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm going to move on to Omari. Omari, please introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. My name is Omari Rush. I am calling in from my home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I am here also as the executive director of CultureSource. CultureSource is a Detroit-based coalition of cultural organizations and creative people serving folks in Southeast Michigan. As I thought about the session prompt, it made me kind of think three things that I just wanted to share from the start, from the beginning. One is that this idea regarding budgets being moral documents, this is something that I'm still thinking about a little bit, but certainly I would say I think everything that an organization does and all of its tools are actually expressions of beliefs and values, what the organization thinks is right and wrong, and that this energy is not unique to budgets. It's not even more powerful in budgets, and that when folks think that, it just gives people maybe an excuse not to act because they can say, we don't have the money. The second point is that, working within budgets as tools for advancing what your organization believes, I think, there's an opportunity to avoid, superficial or one-time investments as, stand-ins for deep commitments to what an organization believes. We saw this quite a bit, for example, with, website statements about people's beliefs in racial equity, but not, those not actually meaning that the organization really understood or embraced it at its core. And then finally, related to that, thinking very deeply and broadly about finances, I think there is a wide opportunity for organizations to take every opportunity to spend, their resources in ways that elevate, for instance, staff, contractors, vendors, artists, even volunteers, invest in them in ways that, lifts up folks who've been oppressed by privilege in the past because of race. And so, not just thinking about it as a program or not just thinking about it as a staff position, but really, getting in there and thinking about all the different ways that you can spend your money in all corners and pockets of a budget. Really happy to be here today and really happy to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Omari. And last but not least, Marc.
Well, thank you so much. I really am delighted to be here. I'm Marc Scorca, President and CEO of Opera America, the National Association for Opera. And I will say that in preparing for this session, and even in thinking back to our preparatory session, I really have come to appreciate this topic, and I've actually done a webinar on it already, is I think it's so important. Yes, the budget is the way to learn about an organization's priorities. And from a budget, you can really determine the alignment between the narrated values of the organization and the values of the organization that are actually in place. Opera America is a funder. We have many grant programs and we give out a substantial amount of money every year. And I review the applications, and inevitably, the first page of the application that I review is the budget page, because from the budget that is presented by our members, we get to really understand what they mean in the project that is in front of us. So, for instance, the proposal may be about an artist development program, but when you look at the budget, most of the money goes to administration or overhead. You understand what the relative values are. Or the proposal may be for a new work, a new opera, but the commissioning fees are very small. for the composer and librettist, and the budget for the sets and costumes is enormous. So, I recognize that salaries and overhead are important, and I know that costumes and sets are essential. And yet, in looking at the ratios and looking at proportionalities in the budget, it tells you a lot about where the values of the organization really live. So at the simplest level, I do think that it is possible for opera companies for any organization, to reflect its objectives and its core values in budgetary commitments. For instance, if an organization is really dedicated to education and believes in its education programs, how much is actually committed in the core budget to education programs? And we find across the opera industry, it's a very small percentage, although it gets a lot of narrative space. What if, as a policy decision, one decides that we're going to spend between 5 and 10% of our core budget on education programs because that's how much we believe in it, or 10 to 15, or whatever the percentage is, but that one actually determines that the core commitment to education is reflected in a slice of a range of what the core budget is? Or what if it is about a commitment to delivering public programs, and how much of the budget actually is dedicated to those programs? Or to community partnerships? Within the budget, does money from the budget actually go to community partners to help them sustain those partnerships? And not only are those questions that should be asked, but they are actually questions that can be answered in terms of some fundamental commitments to parts of the operating budget. Similarly, do we have paid fellowships for people who are aspiring to take on leadership roles? Do we have paid internships? How are those reflected as a commitment of our budget? Now, at a more sophisticated level, I also think it's possible to have other subsidiary goals, so that do we have, if we're committed to, say, gender parity, do we have some percentage of our vendors we want to be in women-owned businesses or businesses that are owned by people of color? Are we prepared to reflect our commitments to diversity and to justice in our budget and our purchasing patterns? Now, it doesn't show up in the numbers, but there can be budgeting policies that follow on the numbers to really achieve our goals. So in a couple of final notes here, in making these comments, I realize that the traditional way we formulate budgets doesn't necessarily support this objective of having them be moral documents. So, for instance, Opera America is engaging in a year-long consultation with the firm Team Dynamics to do a year of EDI training for the Opera America staff. But that commitment is just buried in other expenses. We have a commitment to paid internships. We pay our interns at New York City minimum wage, but it just appears as part of our administrative budget. So that even at Opera America, our budgetary commitments are not reflected in the document that is our budget. We would have to narrate it. So I wonder, as an organization, or frankly, as a funder, is there a different way to formulate our budgets? Is there a way so it's not by functional area, but that our budgets are also presented by core value commitments? Another way of looking at budgets, so that we have a document that really tells the truth about where we set our priorities. So those are some introductory thoughts and, frankly, some messages to me in the way I might want to reformulate the Opera America budget and reformulate our application forms. Thanks so much.
Marc, thank you, because you really laid out some specific examples of how your commitments can actually show up in the budget. But I actually want to go back to Omari, because in your opening remarks, you said that you're still sort of thinking about that concept of a budget being a moral document. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Yeah, certainly. I think part of what I was saying there is that I don't know that it's any more important, any less, like it's any more important than any other thing that your organization has to offer, whether you have a list of values that you state, a list of guiding principles, a mission statement, a vision statement. I think all of these things are expressions of what we think are good and important in the world, and good and important to work on for the public good. And so one, I don't think a budget is special in that way. Two, at the end of the day, and Mark, there in a way touched on this, and I've learned this after working with our auditors every year and understanding what they do, and that being that you can pull whatever story you want to out of a budget, and you can certainly an auditor puts the numbers down there, and so you see black and white numbers at the end of the day. But the story that you tell behind them can change wildly, and so when we look at just the numbers on the page, I don't know that always is the clearest sign about what an organization believes. I think it is an element, and it needs to absolutely be attended to, but I don't think it's the full story.
Leanne, do you mind responding to that? Because you sort of, you had a different take in your opening.
Yeah, but I was actually sort of thinking about what you said, Mark, in regards to thinking about different ways to kind of categorize or put those things on the page. I think a light bulb in a sense sort of went off for me. If we have line items in our budget for marketing or education or things like that, shouldn't we also be able to kind of put line items in our budget about our values so that we can sort of extract some of those things out of the sort of buried, embedded aspects of things that we are thinking about and how we spend our money? I think it would just make it more clear for us as well. And I think it would also sort of help us to track and measure what we're doing, as well as, sort of set some ambitious goals around them, because it's right there and we're sort of able to align what we're actually doing with the values that we say that we have.
Are you referring to the idea of actually narrating the budget, which is what Mark talked about?
Yeah, and he also mentioned, sort of thinking about if we have, line items for marketing, education, that sort of thing, can't we have them for our values as well?
Got it. Well, there's already a question that's come in. And that question is looking at a 990 enough to learn about an organization's budget and their financial commitments? Do you all want to respond to that?
Yeah, I look at my 990 I look at 990s when I'm having trouble sleeping. I'm not sure that it does. I don't know that the 990 captures the kind of information we want that would reflect our core values. There is more detail in a 990 than you would have in just a regular, budget that's on your website. So I think it's an interesting place to look, but I don't know that the 990 fully gets there.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
I would say that I agree 100%. I am a big fan of 990s. I look them up all the time. It's a very interesting document. It speaks of the health of a company and where they are financially, but it doesn't really show you where the money's going or where it really is coming from. Because when we speak of a budget, we don't only talk about money going out, we talk about money coming in. And I think money coming in also is a reflection of where the values are. Where is this money coming from? Who is your board? Where are they bringing to the table? And I think that's the fear that we have, and we have to really think about not only institutions in larger cities and what that money is coming from, who the donors, who are the boards of directors, but we have to think about small communities. Who are their donors? Who are their board of directors? What are their fears? Do they follow? Do they really believe in the value of the organization? Do they follow the passion of the organization? So that the budget has multiple angles and a lot of hidden secrets, because you cannot really tell, like, who are you hiring? You only see a line that says independent contractors. You don't see, like, who independent are they diverse? Are we working on an inclusive type of environment? That's the goal. ultimately that's the goal, but that scares some funders and that scares some board of directors. So we just need to be brave when it comes to our budgets and our discussion of our passions and our values and our mission with everybody. There has to be a transparency. I equate it to the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing a lot of tip of iceberg right now, and the tip of the iceberg seems to be looking amazing in a lot of institutions. But are we digging in to the big part of the iceberg? Are we seeing what's at the root of it? Who are your stagehands? Who is part of your board? What do they look like? So all that information is very hard to tell, but there's some information in the budgets, money coming in, money going out, that really helps us understand the health of the institution and where's the planning, like what kind of funding are they applying for. That tells you a lot of information.
So that's really interesting to me. Thank you. Because how does where the money comes in reflect your values and your priorities? Anybody want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure on organizations, orchestras, opera companies. They're really expensive to put together and to perform those sorts of things. And so I think, based on the way that nonprofits are funded in the US, there's a lot of pressure for people to kind of, don't make that person who can write you that 6-figure check angry, don't want to get on the bad side of that foundation, tell them, the best story that you can, those sorts of things. And so I think, as Anna, you were saying, this lack of transparency, or sort of, I don't know, sometimes people may have to spin or sort of think about how they talk about their work, because there's a real risk to, you might lose something if you say something that people aren't necessarily aligned with, even if it is your kind of value. But I think it's really time for us to, take those bold stands and to be brave and say, if this institution or this funding body doesn't, support the way that we are thinking about our bold initiative to be more representative, to, hire women and minority-owned businesses or things like that, then maybe we have to make those tough decisions about stepping away and thinking about what are other ways that we can find the support that we need to do what we want to do.
Yeah. And the just in response to Anna's very good point, and a question that's in the chat, a performance program tells you a whole lot about the money in. So yes, the 990 might tell you about expenses. Hopefully, a nonprofit will have some kind of audit or budgetary document on their website. But a performance program tells you a lot about an organization, where the money comes from, whether it is supported at the grassroots level, whether it is supported only by a few individuals, who the corporate contributors are, the foundation donors are. So if you want to look at the income stream, certainly the performance program is a place to go.
But does that automatically mean if you have a number of large donors and not as many smaller donors, that you are being dictated to by the large donors?
It doesn't necessarily mean that, because there are some organizations where the very enlightened large donors give the money because they just believe in the mission and the work of the company, and they don't dictate, they just support. There are other organizations that are not as well run, where big donors, get to have sway. So no, there is no real way to learn about that cultural behavior just from either a performance program or for a budget.
So I want to lift up another question. Thank you, Mark, from the chat. You touched on other ways, public information to find out about a company's budget and the program. Another question said, are there ways to make budgets more transparent? And how can we hold all stakeholders accountable? And if there are any processes that we can learn from?
I don't know that there are, at the end of the day, a lot of, many public agencies have a certain kind of mandated transparency, but outside of them, financial transparency, with nonprofits or, publicly traded companies stops at their kind of audited financials. And so to get more is really asking, some of those organizations to go above and beyond in their reporting. And so, that would just be a kind of a sector change. Certainly, I think asking questions of an organization just directly and not overly reading into some of the financials is probably a good idea. Someone on I can't remember who. I'll find it and maybe try to drop it in the chat without being disruptive. But someone just had a critique of Charity Navigator and the ways in which they describe an organization as being highly impactful or I'll say investment worthy based on the way that their 990 looks. And it's about standards of saying that you spend X amount on overhead and that percentage is very high, automatically you're an irresponsible nonprofit, or you have a operating loss for a year or 2 years, automatically you're not a good nonprofit. And those are gradually becoming outdated ways of actually assessing the quality of work, the impact of work that an organization does over its kind of long-term arc. And so a lot of the questions about kind of looking at these financials, there are limits to those documents. And I just, I encourage people to really comprehensively look at what an organization is doing. Mark talked about looking at their program. You got to look at the program, the people, the board. If they have one donor, maybe they have one person that just like absolutely believes in their work and just says, you do what you do. I'm here to get you what you need. That's kind of wonderful. Maybe they don't have to then invest resources in kind of going person to person in their neighborhood to get funding. And so I think in looking at budgets, we have to stop short of making lots of assumptions and filling in gaps where there's not a narrative, where there's not a story, and get good at talking to an organization or looking more comprehensively at its work history and impacts.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on what Omar just said so well and connect it to what Mariella is asking in the chat. And that in my thinking about this so far, I'm not thinking so much about external accountability, but I am trying to increase internal reflection, that people are really bored, the staff are sitting down together and asking the really important question of themselves about whether their budget is a reflection of their articulated values. Because yes, external examination of it is always important. Transparency matters, but the internal digestion of this dynamic between budget and core values is something that I really want to bring home to our members and perhaps to some of the people who are listening to this session.
Thank you, Mark. Leanne, I wanted to ask you about this question before we move on, mainly because you said the League has done a lot of work, both modeling and also working with your members. How are you finding people talking about holding their stakeholders accountable? And are there any learnings that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think, in the orchestra world, it's all about sort of, putting forward perfect face, perfect performance, orchestral excellence, artistic excellence, those sorts of things. So it's actually, asking people to have that kind of internally reflective moment, to think about, do our expenditures, do our investments match what we're saying? Are we just, talking about this thing, but actually not, putting in the actions or the resources behind it. I think, a big part of this has been, people having those conversations and coming to this place of understanding of, the more that we do this, the more, financial resources it's taking, but it also means that we need to think about our staffing structures. And, we need to think about, can we be curious and ask people to reflect back to us of how we're doing and how things are going and what we could do better? And so I think, a big part of it has really been, sort of breaking down some of those barriers to having those reflective internal conversations and, making it more normalized for people to be able to say, we tried something and it didn't work, or, we want to do this in a different way. That I think that's been a big thing for people, just to sort of be able to have those kinds of moments. They weren't really happening in those kinds of ways before.
Thank you. I want to leave space if anybody else wants to follow that. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to a next question. And I'm not quite sure how it's meant, but the follow-up was, how do we consider COVID and recovery as part of these processes? So I don't know if that means being a little looser because of COVID considerations or really shoring up our values because of, Anna.
I have a point on COVID and what has happened throughout the last year. I think that it has put a lot of pressure in a nonprofit institution to really try to balance that budget and make it work. And the truth is that the funding that we've gotten from the government, the SVOG, that help that we've gotten that is reflected in our budgets should be a commitment that these institutions have towards our community. It's money that is coming from the government. It should go back to the community. It should tie us up in a micro level to our neighborhoods. And I think that it's hard to see, but if you see that line in the budget that says this money came from, to help us stay alive, to help us continue art, then we have a responsibility. That power comes with a responsibility to really show our communities that we're there for them. And I think that I'm going to add to this that there's a constant fear of nonprofit organizations to take big leaps and make drastic changes because they don't want to rock the boat. And they feel like they're afraid to lose the donors, to lose the board members that don't agree or don't agree with part of those values. But the way we inspire them is by continuously to show them what a great impact the nonprofit has, that we have. At National Sawdust, we have an amazing lack of mentorship. That mentorship is towards women, non-binary, younger musicians, composers. That big passion that we have for the future of the art form will always help us get that funding, and it will always show in our bottom line. But the COVID situation is it's also how do we invest again in people, and the people that actually we had to let go. We have to cut their salaries. We have to go back to getting those people back in the same salary they were, and we're getting all that help. So we have to give back to the community and our personal community that is our staff.
Thank you. Again, going to the questions. In goal setting to address and prioritize serious issues, what do meaningful goals or quotas look like? I'm going to add to that because I'm realizing that we've been talking about, a couple of you have given specific examples, but if you could also give some additional specific examples of what those serious issues are that you're seeking to address in your organization and what the goals and the word that's used here is quotas. Is that what you're also working towards, quotas? And this is for anyone.
Well, I think people can be intentional about it. If you say you want to increase your board representation by X percentage, but you're not thinking about, you're just looking for, I don't know, I need more Black board members or things like that, but you're not necessarily thinking a little bit more about, what else besides their race perhaps might be beneficial to you, what might attract them to you. So I think just being a little bit more intentional about it is one way that I think that is specific that can help people set some goals that are actually achievable, instead of sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall and, giving up because you didn't get 18 people like you wanted, but who are the people that you're looking for? What specifically is it about them that will add value to the mix that you already have? And what will what do they get out of it as well? I think is a good example.
So you're advocating for meaningful goals, but not necessarily quotas, is what I'm hearing.
No, I think you can do both.
You can do both.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Taneshia, part of what I heard, Leanne, if I might characterize what I thought you said, part of what I heard is in Leanne's comments, which I agree with, is this more of a focus maybe on asking why, and more on a focus of really having the organization think about what they're actually trying to achieve and why, as opposed to immediately thinking that there's a number in mind or a number in mind, which, numbers are great in order to kind of show a movement from here to here to here. But without a kind of a robust process that involves dialogue amongst the staff or deep introspection amongst the organization leader, any kind of ticks up, I just feel like is not as rich or meaningful, because the kind of core reasoning behind it isn't there. Taneshia, if I might also just quickly just say something about the COVID question, which is, I'm going to choose to interpret that, and I fully may be interpreting this wrong, as like, but we've had this crisis and now we don't have as much money, so how can we spend on, quote, diversity, Right. And that's the troubling thing about thinking that so much about that purely just where dollars are allocated is the thing. Because if there's not dollars there, then it's easy to say that, oh, well, we can't do these kinds of programs, which is why I think so much of this has to start with a kind of a core belief, a core understanding. Each staff member really kind of internalizing what equity means to them and how that shows up in their work as the as the chief accountant, as the marketing coordinator, as the program director, and that kind of core belief, that core cultural competency influencing the range of decisions that they make, whether it's what vendor to hire, how that resource a program, all kinds of things. So.
Well, thank you, because I wasn't just I want to say for the first time for this, but I'm reminding myself, I have a note here that you said we talk about the full range of ways that we can think about equity across administrative, artistic, and audience work, and starting there first before budget. I'm sorry, and I cut someone off. I'm not sure.
Well, I was going to say, and Omar brings up a point that I have, that I respond to a lot when people say, well, we don't have the money to do that X, Y, or Z. And I just say, face it, everything we do loses money. There's nothing that we do that makes money. So it's a matter of choosing how you want to lose money. So the idea that, we can't afford to do that education program unless it pays for itself. Carmen doesn't pay for itself. So it is a matter of choosing how you lose the money. Or, in other words, choose how you allocate the money in your budget to reflect your core values. To the question about, quotas or diversity, I don't believe that diversifying the board is a number. It is a way of being, and that the diversity of a board has to grow from the legitimate and authentic partnerships you have in the community, so that you are meeting people who will think like you and believe in what you do, and you will embrace what they do and the way they think about what they do. And that comes from investment over time in community programs and partnerships and co-creation of work with these partners, which gets back to the budget of whether you are allocating in the budget sufficient resources to build these partnerships that have time to ripen, so that relationships lead to greater diversity that is reciprocal in nature. And to say that we don't have money, again, is just, I think, a way to escape it. We don't have money to do anything that we do. It is a matter of allocating the monies that we do have. So just, a few of the points linked together here.
Thank you. That is an important point, and we have less than 20 minutes to go. And I'm surprised it took this long for people to bring this up, and that's about pay, right? And so one of the questions that we have here is, one of the inequitable parts of the industry historically has been pay for nonprofit employees. Do you have thoughts on ways that we as an industry can push towards more equitable pay?
Well, I'm going to say that's the mistake when we look at a P&L or a balance sheet or a 990, is that we are seeing a line for human resources for payroll, but we don't get to see how everybody gets paid and what that entails. And I think that for the longest time, we've asked our community, our stagehands, our artists to take pay cuts, to do their work because they love the art. Yes, to donate their time to, and that's a change that needs to happen. And we need to put the art first. We really need to put the artists, the art, the people that we are trying to support in our communities. And not only, and I'm not talking about the artists, the art always, the art needs every single person in the company, in the organization, not only the artists, but the stagehands, the orchestra, everybody. So everybody needs to be lifted up. Everybody needs to be putting the same level of investment into the organization. So yes, I do believe that there has to be some changes happening in equal pay as well. But then when you see the budget and you see that chunk of money going to staff salaries, you feel like, okay, so how come that's not going to the art? Well, the art is that too. The art, the people that make the art are not the ones that are on stage alone. There's all these back people, all the administration, all this stuff. They need to also get paid. Also, we need to invest in the future of the art form. We need to start putting money towards the younger generations to see what we're doing and to learn and to know that there is a future where they can make a living being part of the art form, not only being an artist, but they can be one of us as administrators or stage manager. There's all these different parts of our industry that require, talented, diverse people.
And so do you think that sometimes it requires a shift for thinking? This is where I become a little bit more activated as an active moderator, because I actually experienced this, right? Not necessarily at the organization I lead now, but the one before. And I remember I proposed paying our interns, and I was told we never did that before. And I said, well, we're going to start doing that now. And so, when people, I will just say this, the interns that we had before that, they were pretty much the same, right? They could afford to work for free, right? We're in a fairly affluent community of Princeton, New Jersey. And so this idea of paying, though, interns was kind of a foreign concept for our 50-year-old nonprofit. So how in organizations that have now moved to this idea of paid internships, was that a difficult thing for you to do, or did you just decide you're going to do this and this is part of our values?
At Opera America, we just decided to do it. That we were so, and it's been a number of years now, but it was like getting hit on the head with a frying pan, recognizing that who can afford to do this on an unpaid basis? Young people with student loans, young people who need to have summer jobs or winter jobs to supplement going to school. And it was like, duh, of course we have to pay these people. And we just, so we've done it. And as I said, at New York City minimum wage. But I also, just connecting your question though to COVID, I think a reckoning is at hand. What we've talked about here of the low pay is what, in the 1960s, they, called the hidden subsidy. And that was the hidden subsidy of staff working for much less than they would earn in the for-profit sector, that the collective staff were in a way, and the artists were the largest patrons of the arts organizations. With COVID, I think there's been a moment of re-examination about how time is spent, how we live our lives, and some of the low pay, heavy work dynamic that is preponderant in our field is up for examination right now. And I think coming out of COVID, we're going to have to really face the reality of paying people fairly for their work.
But do you think there's also this lack of seeing the artists as professionals themselves? Again, experienced that during COVID, when in the organization that I'm in now, proposed to pay artists to do some work related to relief. And it required a shift in some thinking. And so I'm thinking about your opening remarks where, in the commissioning, the librettist, right, and composer were being paid less in the budget than the other folks. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I would say that, I don't want to, this does not fall under the category of silver lining, but so many patrons and board members are friendly with many artists who travel around the country in our opera art form, and they realized how vulnerable those artists were when all of the work disappeared for 2 years of COVID. And the personal stories, the vulnerability of the artists came home to a lot of people who recognize that we have to think differently about how folks are contracted and compensated, how they are protected, thinking about how do we treat them as employees so they're sure of having unemployment insurance, although, in the relief bills, we had that temporarily. So I think COVID opened a lot of eyes about the vulnerability of the artist in a very beneficial way.
Right. And so even though that question probably wasn't interpreted in terms of equitable pay for the artist, that's the way that I wanted to ask, because it is something that I've noticed in this industry. Anybody else want to respond? Yes.
I do want to say that in my 20 years of working in the opera business, a lot changed when COVID happened. There was a movement of a lot of artist managers and opera companies that were actually paying their artists that could not perform. And they didn't have to. Like our contracts were not set up to deal with a pandemic. They really weren't. And there were so many companies that really went out of their way to pay full fees, half fees, whatever they could afford. Some didn't. And, I can go on and say, I don't understand why they didn't. But what I realized that a lot of conversations have been had about this topic since the pandemic hit. And a lot of contracts have changed because of it. How the work that an opera singer, for example, does prior to getting to the company needs to be paid. It is not only when they arrived with the music learned and coached and ready to go, then they deserve their money. They deserve their money when they started 6 months ago working with their teacher on it. So all those things, I've seen a shift in the theaters in the United States to really value the work that artists do prior to arrive into the engagement.
Thank you for that. I'm trying to keep conscious of time to give each of you a moment to make a wrap up comment, but I do want to touch on the last one I see in the chat. Do any of the panelists think that there is a problem when making goals and or quotas and the way philanthropy/fundraising traditionally works? For example, do we budget with fear of losing major donors?
I think there's a shift in philanthropy right now, actually, and I think COVID has been a big part of that. I think people are much more open to the idea that, we can work in partnership with the people that we're funding or the organizations that we're funding. And so I think there's a bit more curiosity from philanthropies to find out how can we actually help you, as opposed to sort of the kind of top-down, hierarchical, here are the hoops that you should jump through, here are the things that you should do that we're telling you, even though we're not necessarily totally in tune with your situation and your context. And so I feel like that's hopeful. I feel like there is a great opportunity for us to be able to say what didn't work. We can have productive failures and learn from them. And so I think that also can influence, the way that we talk about how we're budgeting, the way that we're investing our money in the infrastructure, and how that's reflecting our values. So I think there's an opportunity. I think there might be a little bit of shift. I think it can change.
Thank you.
That opportunity for failure is so important. Related, unrelated. This morning I saw a tweet about legendary Georgetown coach John Thompson, and he was saying that when thinking about the lack of, at that time, Black coaches in the college basketball, a lot of it had to do with Black coaches not being given an opportunity because they had to be perfect in order to become a coach. And they were not given the opportunity to fail and try again, but you had to be perfect. And so I feel like there's a little bit of, certainly Leanne just talked about that. And there's a little bit about that in the way that folks who are philanthropic are analyzing financials and seeing, when people set a goal or are looking to make some kind of radical change, it may not work the first time. And so, and that may look like one's earned revenue tanked in a year. And how is an organization not fully penalized because of that? Which is why I think the whole idea about just as much both narrative, like having a budget narrative or kind of an explanation, is so important to having that when you can insert that, and using every word count that, every word or character that you can to make some of those things clear is so important. But also, again, in just the kind of overall expression of what your organization is doing on your website, in social media, as your leader or kind of lead external staff or talking to people, that you're always communicating the range of your values and connecting that to outcomes, or connecting that to impacts, or connecting that to just like experimentation.
To one point in the question, I think we who are in a leadership position need to recognize that we have a responsibility to try to move people along in their understanding of what needs to happen today to achieve certain goals and values that we've articulated, and that we need to use our every ounce of our persuasiveness to move the entire community of our organization forward. There may be some people who cannot travel with us on that journey, and we need to be prepared to appreciate what they've done in the past and perhaps give up on those relationships. So I don't believe that we can justify being anchored in the past, a past we may not be in accord with any longer. We can't be anchored there because there are some donors who will not move along with us. It's hard, and yet I think it is necessary for us to achieve our values and not somehow be held back by some notions of the irreplaceable patron.
Thank you.
I will add to that there is a fear that our board members are not going to come along, and that we need their support and we need their money. And there's a narrative out there that says, well, yes, we can always find more. Finding committed donors takes huge passion. It takes a really good mission statement, a good core values of the institution for them to see. We start there. If we start there and put that money where our values are, the right donors, the right board members will come our way. It will take outreach. It will take engaging. The programming will have a lot to do with it. But I agree that there's a shift that needs to happen from staff to artists to board members. So everybody is in this together with the same vision and the same mission.
Well, we're almost out of time. And so I want to give each of you an opportunity to give what I would call a closing remark on this topic, and in any order. I'm going to call on you, Leanne.
I guess I will say, and thanks to fellow panelists for conversation and your thoughts and insights. I certainly have some things to think about as I kind of move forward off of this call. But I think the one thing that I'm carrying away from this is that I'm really hopeful. I think we've talked a lot today about how, there is a lot of fear and trepidation around, losing sources of support, or, the effort and energy it takes to find, sources of support to replace those that we might lose when we're leading with our values. But I'm hopeful. I think we're in a moment where our field, our industry is getting more comfortable with that, and like recognizing that it's important for its sustainability and its future, and that we owe it to our patrons and our donors and our supporters and our communities, to live and act in the way that we say. And so I think I'm hopeful that we will see some different takes on budgeting, and just really thinking about how we fund and how we put support structures around that funding to be sustainable and more inclusive organizations.
Thank you. Mark, you want to go next?
Thanks so much. When you're on a panel, it may appear that the panelists know something that they're imparting, and I just wanted to express my gratitude for this invitation and for the prep call that we had in this session, because talking about this has really helped me reframe the way I want to think about and talk about budgets and how I want to use our budget as an instrument for progress and for accountability. And I hadn't thought about all of that before. So with those who may be listening, I'm a panelist who has learned with everyone else on this session, and I'm really grateful to my colleagues, and I've learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead. So yes, this has been a privilege to share this space with you. I think this is a conversation that it needs to be ongoing. I think that like Mark, I will always now look at my budget differently. Every project budget will carry the weight of the mission of National Sawdust and the mission of myself as an arts professional as well. I think that I heard an analogy this morning in one of the sessions that if you have mold in one of your walls, it's very easy just to paint over it and forget the mold is there. But I think that it's more expensive just to tear the wall down and build it again. But sometimes that's what we have to do. We just really, and I truly believe money is fluid. Money, if you put it in the universe and do the right thing, it will come back to you. People will really buy into you in what you believe in. But you have to believe in it as an institution for people to say, I want to support it. And I think that's the biggest risk that we all take as a nonprofit institution, is to sort of jump into the abysm and say, you know, follow me if you believe in what I believe. And we're sort of have to close our eyes and go, okay, I'm going to go. Come with me or stay behind.
I'm not sure if I'm keeping track. Omari, did you have a closing remark? No, and then I'm going to do a closing remark.
I'll go now. And so thank you, Taneshia, for facilitating this interesting conversation, and certainly fellow panelists, thank you for the stimulating ideas that you shared. The thing that I come back to in the prompt that's really kind of curious is this idea that, you know, folks having an allergic reaction to quotas or to goals and to budgets and numbers and what they mean. And I guess I would just encourage people to kind of lean into that allergic reaction in a way, you know, in kind of our own biology, that allergic reaction is telling us that we need to pay attention to something, you know? And so I would say that if you are someone who is challenged by your budget, if someone presents a challenge to you about why you've done something in a budget, it's a real opportunity for learning, and it's a real opportunity to investigate, why is that making me feel anxious? Is it because I really don't believe in spending in this way? Is it because I'm already doing this and I'm annoyed that people are now making me articulate it when I don't need to articulate it because it's what I believe? Is it because people don't know what I believe? And so, you know, as alongside all the other things that we've said, I just encourage that little bit of tension that comes in those moments for you to use that as an opportunity for some introspection and progress.
Thank you all so much, because I've learned a lot from you, and I'm going to give in 30 seconds why I was mostly quiet in this conversation. I took over an organization that's about 35 years old, that's running a near 100-year-old historic performing arts center. But I feel like we had freedom, the freedom to be bold. I'm a Black woman, the sole Black woman running a Symphony Hall Performing Arts Center in the entire state of New Jersey. And 3 years ago, we did talk about our specific mission, vision, and values. And because we've stayed very true to that, and the idea that we're going to center the global majority, which is about to be the majority of population in New Jersey, we've been laser focused on that. And thankfully, because of that freedom has allowed us to raise an enormous amount of money in a short period of time. But I realized that is a freedom because I wasn't going into an existing structure, that culture that had to be sort of maintained and maybe gradually moved over. So I learned a lot, because I think eventually this will mature a little bit and I might not have the same sort of freedom. So thank you so much. I learned so much from you all, and I hope everyone that that came in to join us today did as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.